The morning sun cast long shadows across the military firing range as soldiers gathered for their weekly shooting practice. Among them stood James Mitchell, a newly appointed Royal Guard who had joined the ceremonial unit just 3 months earlier. At 42, he was older than most of the other guards, with graying temples and quiet eyes that seemed to hold secrets nobody bothered to ask about. The other guards had already formed their opinions about Mitchell. He was the silent type who kept to himself, never joining their conversations about weekend plans or sharing stories from his past. During their ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace, he performed his role with mechanical precision, but showed no interest in the camaraderie that usually developed among the guards. Some whispered that he was just another desk soldier who had somehow landed a prestigious posting through connections rather than merit. Sergeant Davies, a 28-year-old with a sharp tongue and an even sharper opinion of himself, had taken particular pleasure in making subtle jabs at the older guard. Davies had earned his position through years of exemplary service in the regular army, and felt that ceremonial roles should be reserved for those who had proven themselves in real combat situations. To him, Mitchell represented everything wrong with the modern military, all show and no substance. As the guards lined up at their designated shooting positions, Davies made sure his voice carried across the range. He had been the top marksman in his unit for 3 consecutive years, and never missed an opportunity to remind others of this fact. The other guards gathered around him, feeding off his confidence and enjoying the entertainment he provided at Mitchell's expense. Mitchell quietly took his position at the far end of the line, checking his rifle with the methodical care of someone who had done this countless times before. His movements were economical and precise, but the other guards interpreted this as the nervous behavior of someone trying too hard to appear competent. They had no idea that every gesture came from muscle memory, built over decades of handling weapons in situations where a single mistake could mean the difference between life and death. The range instructor called for attention and began explaining the day's exercise. They would be shooting at targets placed at various distances, starting with standard 100-meter shots before moving to longer ranges. Points would be awarded based on accuracy, and as always, there would be informal bragging rights for whoever performed best. Davies cracked his knuckles dramatically and made a show of adjusting his stance, drawing chuckles from his admirers. Mitchell simply listened, his expression unchanged. He had heard similar briefings in places where the stakes were infinitely higher than earning respect from fellow guards. The weight of his rifle felt familiar in his hands, like greeting an old friend after a long absence, but he kept these feelings buried beneath the surface, maintaining the unremarkable facade that had served him well since joining the Royal Guard. As the instructor finished his briefing, Davies turned to the group with a grin that bordered on cruel. He had been planning this moment for weeks, waiting for the perfect opportunity to expose what he believed was Mitchell's incompetence in front of everyone. The firing range provided the ideal stage for his performance, a place where skill could not be hidden behind ceremony or protocol. The morning air was crisp and still, perfect conditions for shooting. Davies had checked the weather report twice and knew that wind would not be a factor today. Every advantage was on his side, and he intended to use them all to demonstrate the vast gap between a real soldier and someone who merely wore the uniform. The other guards sensed the tension building and positioned themselves to get the best view of what promised to be an entertaining demonstration. Mitchell remained focused on his own preparation, running through mental checklists that had become second nature during his years of service. He understood the dynamics playing out around him, but felt no need to engage with the petty politics of the situation. Time had taught him that actions spoke louder than words, and some lessons could only be learned through experience rather than explanation. Davies stepped forward with the confidence of a man who had never met a challenge he could not overcome. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his boots polished to mirror finish, and his rifle held with the casual ease of someone who had spent countless hours perfecting his technique. The other guards formed a loose semicircle behind him, eager to witness what they expected to be a masterclass in marksmanship. "Watch and learn, gentlemen," Davies announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "This is how real soldiers handle their weapons." He glanced deliberately toward Mitchell, ensuring his words hit their intended target. "Some of us earned our place here through skill, not through whatever backdoor connections might have gotten others their positions." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Several guards shuffled uncomfortably, recognizing that Davies had crossed from playful competition into personal attack. But none spoke up in Mitchell's defense. The older guard had never made an effort to build friendships within the unit, and his reserved nature made it easy for others to remain neutral in moments like these. Mitchell continued his preparation without acknowledging the comment. He adjusted his sight with practiced precision, each movement deliberate and economical. Years of training had taught him to block out distractions and focus solely on the task ahead. In his previous life, letting emotions interfere with concentration could have fatal consequences for himself and his teammates. The range instructor called for the first round to begin. Davies positioned himself with theatrical flair, making sure everyone could see his textbook stance. His breathing was controlled, his grip firm but not tense, and his eye alignment perfect. These were skills he had honed through thousands of practice rounds and several tours of duty, where accuracy mattered. He squeezed the trigger with the smooth motion of a professional, sending his first shot downrange with complete confidence. The target returned with a score that drew approving murmurs from the watching guards. Davies had placed his shot within the inner rings, a respectable showing that matched his reputation. He stepped back with a satisfied grin and made an elaborate gesture of wiping imaginary sweat from his brow, playing to his audience like a performer on stage. "Not bad for a warm-up," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Of course, consistency is what separates the professionals from the amateurs. Anyone can get lucky with a single shot, but sustained performance under pressure reveals true skill. His eyes found Mitchell again, ensuring the message was received. The other guards took their turns, each producing scores that ranged from competent to impressive. The atmosphere remained light and competitive, with good-natured ribbing between friends who had trained together for years. Davies provided running commentary on each performance, offering tips and encouragement to his favorites while maintaining pointed silence about others. When Mitchell's turn arrived, the conversation died to a whisper. All eyes focused on the quiet guard who had become the subject of so much speculation. He moved to the firing line with the same unhurried precision he brought to every task, showing no signs of nervousness despite the attention focused on him. Davies positioned himself for the best view of what he expected to be an embarrassing display of incompetence. He had already planned his response to various scenarios. A missed target would prompt jokes about needing glasses, while a poor score would lead to suggestions about additional training. In his mind, there was no possibility that Mitchell could produce anything approaching his own performance. The older guard settled into his stance with movements that seemed almost mechanical in their efficiency. His breathing pattern shifted into the slow, controlled rhythm that serious marksmen use to steady their aim. For just a moment, something flickered behind his quiet eyes, a flash of the intensity that had once made him one of the most feared snipers in the British Special Forces. But the watching guards saw none of this. To them, Mitchell appeared nervous and uncertain, trying too hard to look competent while clearly out of his depth. Davies smiled with anticipation, already savoring the moment when his superiority would be confirmed for everyone to see. The stage was set for what he expected to be a decisive demonstration of the difference between real soldiers and ceremonial guards. Mitchell's first shot rang out across the firing range with a sharp crack that seemed to echo longer than the others. The sound itself was unremarkable, but something about the way he had fired, the stillness before the shot, the minimal movement afterward, caught the attention of the more experienced shooters present. The range instructor raised his binoculars to check the target, his expression shifting from routine interest to genuine surprise. The target showed a perfect bullseye, dead center with surgical precision, not just within the scoring rings, but so perfectly placed that it looked like it had been measured and marked by hand. The instructor double-checked through his binoculars before announcing the score, his voice carrying a note of respect that had been absent moments before. Davies felt his confident smile waver slightly. A lucky shot, he told himself. Even broken clocks were right twice a day, and anyone could get fortunate on a single attempt. But something about Mitchell's demeanor bothered him. The older guard showed no excitement or relief at his success, no sign that he considered it anything out of the ordinary. Instead, he simply began preparing for his next shot with the same mechanical precision. The other guards buzzed with surprised conversation. They had expected Mitchell to struggle, perhaps managing a respectable score if he was lucky. None had anticipated such perfect accuracy from someone they had dismissed as a ceremonial soldier with no real combat experience. Several began to reconsider their earlier assumptions, though Davies quickly moved to quell any doubts. "Beginner's luck," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The real test comes with consistency. Any amateur can stumble into one good shot, but maintaining performance over multiple rounds separates the trained marksman from the weekend warriors." He said this with the authority of someone who had never experienced a moment of self-doubt, but his eyes remained fixed on Mitchell with new intensity. The second round commenced with increased attention focused on the quiet guard. Mitchell approached his shooting position with the same unhurried movements, showing no sign that he felt the weight of everyone's expectations. His breathing pattern remained steady, his stance unchanged from the previous shot. To the casual observer, he might have been practicing alone rather than performing under scrutiny. This time, several guards positioned themselves to get a clearer view of his technique. What they saw confused them. Mitchell's stance was textbook perfect, but in a way that seemed effortless rather than studied. Most shooters had to consciously adjust their position, check their grip, and remind themselves of proper form. Mitchell simply assumed the position as if his body knew no other way to hold a rifle. His second shot followed the same pattern as the first. The crack of the rifle, the minimal recoil, the immediate return to ready position without any visible effort to track the target or assess the result. When the score came back as another perfect bullseye, the silence stretched longer than before. Two perfect shots moved beyond the realm of luck and into territory that suggested genuine skill. Davies felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. His own performance had been exemplary by any reasonable standard, but Mitchell was achieving results that belonged in competition shooting rather than routine practice. The younger sergeant found himself studying the older guard's technique, looking for flaws or tricks that might explain the unexpected performance. The range instructor made a note on his clipboard, his professional interest clearly piqued. In 20 years of supervising military shooting practice, he had seen few displays of such consistent accuracy. Most soldiers, even excellent ones, showed some variation in their performance. Mitchell's shots were placed with the precision of a machine, each one identical to the last. Mitchell ejected his spent cartridge and loaded the next round with movements that seemed almost choreographed in their efficiency. Every motion served a purpose, with no wasted energy or unnecessary adjustments. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times under conditions far more stressful than a practice range. The watching guards began to whisper among themselves, their earlier mockery replaced by genuine curiosity about the man they had dismissed so readily. Questions arose that none of them had bothered to ask before. Where had Mitchell served before joining the Royal Guard? What was his military background? How had someone with such obvious skill ended up in what many considered a ceremonial posting? Davies realized he was losing control of the narrative he had carefully constructed. His plan to expose Mitchell as an incompetent had backfired spectacularly, and he could feel his authority within the group beginning to slip. But he was too invested in his position to back down gracefully, and pride prevented him from acknowledging what was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone present. Davies could feel the situation slipping away from him with each perfect shot Mitchell placed downrange. The younger sergeant had built his reputation on being the undisputed best marksman in the unit, and that status was now under direct threat from someone he had publicly mocked. Pride and desperation combined to push him toward a decision that his rational mind might have questioned under different circumstances. "Impressive shooting at basic range," Davies called out, his voice carrying a forced casualness that fooled no one. "But let's see how our ceremonial friend handles a real challenge. How about we move those targets back to 300 meters? That's where the men separate from the boys." He gestured toward the distant targets with theatrical confidence, though sweat had begun to gather at his temples despite the cool morning air. The other guards exchanged glances. 300 meters was significantly beyond their normal practice range, typically reserved for advanced marksman training rather than routine shooting exercises. Most of them would struggle to hit the target consistently at that distance, let alone achieve the kind of precision Mitchell had demonstrated at closer range. Davies was essentially doubling down on a bet that was already going badly for him. The range instructor hesitated before responding. Extended range shooting required additional safety protocols and was not part of the day's planned activities. But the tension between Davies and Mitchell had created an atmosphere that made backing down seem impossible for either man. After a moment's consideration, he nodded his approval, though his expression suggested he had reservations about where this competition was heading. Mitchell listened to the exchange with the same impassive expression he had maintained throughout the morning. 300 meters was indeed a challenging distance for most military shooters, requiring adjustments for wind drift, bullet drop, and other factors that could throw off even experienced marksmen. But for someone with his background, it was merely a different set of calculations rather than an impossible task. As the targets were repositioned and the range reconfigured for the extended distance, Davies worked to rebuild his confidence. He had trained extensively at longer ranges during his deployment to Afghanistan, where engagements often occurred at distances that pushed the limits of standard infantry weapons. 300 meters was at the edge of his comfort zone, but he remained convinced that his formal training gave him advantages that Mitchell could not match. The other guards gathered closer, sensing that they were witnessing something more significant than routine practice. Word had begun to spread to other units on the base, and additional soldiers started appearing at the observation area behind the firing line. What had begun as Davies' attempt to humiliate a fellow guard was evolving into a genuine test of skill that would be talked about for months to come. Mitchell examined the distant targets through his rifle scope, making minute adjustments to his sight settings with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed similar calculations under far more demanding circumstances. In his previous life, 300 meters had been considered close range, and targets at that distance were opportunities rather than challenges. But he kept these thoughts to himself, maintaining the quiet demeanor that had served him well since joining the Royal Guard. Davies took his position first, determined to establish a standard that he believed Mitchell could not match. The wind had picked up slightly, adding an additional variable that would test both men's understanding of ballistics and environmental factors. He spent several minutes calculating adjustments, consulting a small notebook where he had recorded data from previous long-range sessions. The crowd fell silent as Davies settled into his shooting stance. The increased distance meant that even small errors in technique would be magnified dramatically by the time the bullet reached its target. His breathing became more deliberate, each exhale carefully timed to coincide with his natural respiratory pause. The shot, when it came, was followed by a longer wait as everyone strained to see the result on the distant target. Davies' shot struck within the outer scoring rings, a respectable performance that would have earned praise under normal circumstances. But after witnessing Mitchell's perfect accuracy at closer range, the result felt somehow insufficient. Davies tried to project satisfaction with his shooting, but his forced smile could not hide the tension he was feeling about the comparison that was about to unfold. All eyes turned to Mitchell as he approached the firing line. The distant target seemed impossibly small through the naked eye, requiring magnification just to locate them clearly. For most of the watching soldiers, attempting to hit such targets with precision would have been an exercise in hope rather than skill. But Mitchell moved toward his position with the same unhurried confidence he had shown throughout the morning, giving no indication that the increased difficulty concerned him in any way. Mitchell settled into his position behind the rifle with movements that seemed to flow like water. At 300 meters, the target appeared as little more than a small circle through his scope, requiring precise calculations for bullet drop, wind compensation, and atmospheric conditions. But as he aligned his sight picture, muscle memory from countless similar situations took over, and the mathematics of long-range shooting became second nature. The watching crowd had grown to include soldiers from other units who had heard about the unfolding competition. What had started as a routine training session had transformed into an impromptu demonstration that would be discussed in mess halls and barracks for weeks to come. Davies stood among them, his earlier confidence replaced by nervous energy as he watched Mitchell prepare for what many considered an impossible shot. Through his scope, Mitchell could see the wind patterns affecting the grass between his position and the target. Years of experience had taught him to read these subtle indicators, translating the movement of vegetation into precise adjustments for windage and elevation. His breathing slowed to the deep, controlled pattern that had served him well during his years with the Special Air Service. when similar shots had been matters of life and death rather than pride and reputation. The range fell completely silent as Mitchell's finger found the trigger. Even the wind seemed to pause, creating a moment of perfect stillness that experienced shooters recognized as ideal firing conditions. His sight picture was crystal clear, the crosshairs aligned exactly where years of training and instinct told him the bullet needed to go. The shot broke with surgical precision, the rifle recoiling smoothly as the bullet began its journey downrange. The crack of the rifle echoed across the range, followed by the longest silence of the day as everyone waited to see the result. At 300 meters, it took several seconds for the range instructor to locate the bullet hole through his high-powered spotting scope. When he found it, his sharp intake of breath was audible to those standing nearby. The shot had struck dead center of the bull's eye, so perfectly placed that it looked like it had been measured and marked by hand. A collective gasp rose from the assembled soldiers. Many had doubted that such precision was even possible at that distance with standard military equipment. What Mitchell had just accomplished belonged in the realm of competition shooting or specialized sniper training, not routine practice among ceremonial guards. Several soldiers reached for their own spotting equipment, needing to confirm with their own eyes what seemed impossible to believe. Davies felt his world shift beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about shooting, about military hierarchy, about his own place in the pecking order, had just been challenged by a man he had dismissed as a ceremonial soldier with no real combat experience. The perfect shot at 300 meters was not luck or coincidence. It was the demonstration of skill that belonged to an entirely different level of training and experience. Mitchell ejected the spent cartridge and set his rifle aside with the same mechanical precision he brought to every action. His expression remained unchanged, showing no excitement or satisfaction at what others considered an extraordinary achievement. To him, the shot was simply the expected result of proper technique applied under ideal conditions. Nothing more remarkable than successfully tying his boots or buttoning his uniform. The range instructor approached Mitchell with obvious respect, his earlier casual demeanor replaced by the deference typically reserved for senior officers or recognized experts. In his 20 years of supervising military shooting, he had witnessed few displays of such skill from soldiers who were not formally trained as snipers or competitive marksmen. The question that everyone was thinking but no one dared ask hung in the air like smoke from the discharged rifles. Davies struggled to process what he had witnessed. His entire identity within the unit was built on being the superior marksman, the soldier others looked to for guidance and instruction on matters involving weapons and tactics. Mitchell's performance had not just exceeded his own, it had made his earlier boasting seem foolish and uninformed. The younger sergeant found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the quiet guard he had spent months mocking. Other soldiers began approaching Mitchell with obvious curiosity, their earlier indifference replaced by genuine interest in learning about his background and training. Questions that had never seemed important before suddenly took on new significance. Where had he served? What units had he been part of? How had someone with such obvious expertise ended up in what many considered a ceremonial posting, rather than a combat role? But Mitchell deflected their inquiries with polite but firm responses that revealed nothing about his past. He had spent years learning to keep his previous life separate from his current existence, understanding that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The Royal Guard position offered him the peace and anonymity he had earned through decades of service in places where anonymity was often the difference between life and death. The morning shooting. Practice had taken an unexpected turn that would be remembered long after the targets were taken down and the rifles cleaned and stored. But for Mitchell it was simply another day of service, distinguished only by the unwelcome attention his performance had attracted from soldiers who now looked at him with very different eyes than they had when the day began. The shooting demonstration had ended, but the questions it raised refused to fade as easily as the morning mist. Davies found himself walking alongside Mitchell toward the equipment storage area, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine bewilderment and, despite himself, growing respect. The perfect shots at impossible distances had shattered every assumption he had made about the quiet guard, leaving him grappling with the uncomfortable realization that he had badly misjudged the man he had spent months mocking. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Davies finally asked, his voice stripped of its earlier cockiness. The question had been burning in his mind since witnessing the impossible accuracy, but pride had prevented him from asking until they were away from the crowd of curious soldiers. "I've never seen anything like what you just did, not even from our designated marksman." Mitchell continued walking without changing his pace, his expression remaining as neutral as ever. For a moment, Davies thought the older guard would ignore the question entirely, maintaining the wall of silence he had built around his past. But something about the genuine curiosity in the younger man's voice seemed to reach him, prompting him to slow his steps and consider his response carefully. "Different places, different times," Mitchell replied quietly, his words revealing nothing while somehow suggesting vast depths of experience. "Military training tends to vary depending on where you serve and what role you're asked to fill." It was a diplomatic answer that acknowledged the question without providing any real information. The kind of response he had perfected during years of debriefings where saying too much could compromise ongoing operations. But Davies pressed on, his need to understand overriding his usual social boundaries. "I've served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and half a dozen other places where shooting actually mattered. I've trained with some of the best marksmen in the British Army, and none of them could do what you just did." That wasn't regular military training. That was something else entirely. The two men reached the equipment storage area, where other soldiers were cleaning their rifles and storing their gear. Mitchell began the familiar process of breaking down his weapon, each movement precise and economical. The routine gave him time to think about how much, if anything, he wanted to reveal about the chapters of his life that had brought him to this moment. "Some postings require different skills," Mitchell said eventually, his hands never pausing in their methodical cleaning of the rifle. "When you spend enough years in specialized roles, certain abilities become second nature. Muscle memory doesn't fade easily, even when you move to positions where those skills are no longer necessary." Davies felt he was getting closer to something significant, though Mitchell's words remained frustratingly vague. The older guard's careful phrasing suggested military experience that went far beyond standard infantry training. But what exactly that experience entailed remained hidden behind layers of professional discretion and personal privacy. "Specialized roles," Davies repeated thoughtfully. "Like what kind of specialized roles? Because what I saw today wasn't just good shooting. It was the kind of precision that takes years to develop and maintains itself only through constant practice. You don't just stumble into that level of skill." Mitchell finished cleaning his rifle and began storing it in the assigned rack, his movements betraying no urgency, despite the increasingly pointed questions. He had faced far more aggressive interrogations during his career, situations where the wrong answer could have fatal consequences. This conversation, while uncomfortable, posed no real threat to anything except his carefully maintained anonymity. "The kind of roles where accuracy matters more than speed," he said finally, offering Davies the smallest possible glimpse behind the curtain. "Places where missing isn't an option because there usually isn't a second chance to get things right. After a while, that kind of pressure becomes routine, and the skills transfer to other situations even when the stakes are lower." The implications of Mitchell's words began to sink in for Davies, who had enough military experience to recognize what the older guard was carefully not saying. Roles where missing wasn't an option, where there were no second chances, where accuracy mattered more than speed. This was the language of special operations, of missions that never appeared in official records, and soldiers whose names were deliberately forgotten by history. Davies felt a chill of recognition as pieces of a puzzle began falling into place. The age that had seemed like a disadvantage suddenly made sense if Mitchell had served his time in units that recruited only the most experienced soldiers. The quiet demeanor that had appeared antisocial now seemed like the natural behavior of someone trained to remain invisible. Even his posting to the Royal Guard began to make sense as the kind of quiet reward given to veterans of conflicts that could never be officially acknowledged. "Jesus Christ," Davies whispered, his voice barely audible as the full implications hit him. "You're SAS, aren't you? Or we're SAS. That's why you can shoot like that. That's why you never talk about your service record. You're one of those soldiers who officially doesn't exist." Mitchell's hands never paused in their methodical organization of his equipment, but Davies caught the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes that suggested the younger man had guessed correctly. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications and unspoken truths that could never be directly confirmed or denied. Mitchell closed his equipment locker with a quiet click that seemed to echo louder than it should in the sudden silence between the two men. Davies stood frozen, his mind racing as he processed the magnitude of his earlier behavior. For months he had mocked and belittled a man who had likely seen more combat than everyone else in their unit combined, someone whose service record was classified at levels Davies had never imagined existed. "I can neither confirm nor deny anything about past assignments," Mitchell said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of official protocols that had become second nature over decades of service. "But I will say that every soldier deserves respect for their service, regardless of what role they currently fill. Ceremonial duties might seem less important than combat postings, but they serve a purpose that matters to people who need symbols of stability and tradition." The older guard turned to face Davies directly, and for the first time, the younger sergeant saw something in those quiet eyes that made him understand just how badly he had misjudged the situation. There was no anger or resentment, just the calm assessment of a professional who had dealt with far more serious challenges than workplace politics. It was the look of someone who had learned to measure threats accurately and respond proportionally, finding Davies to be neither dangerous nor particularly important. Davies felt heat rising in his face as shame washed over him in waves. Every cruel joke, every dismissive comment, every attempt to undermine Mitchell's position now seemed not just petty, but profoundly disrespectful. He thought about the stories he had heard whispered in military circles about SAS operations, missions behind enemy lines, impossible odds, soldiers who disappeared for months at a time and returned with new scars and haunted eyes. "I owe you an apology," Davies said, his voice thick with embarrassment. "Actually, I owe you a dozen apologies. I've been acting like a complete fool, and I had no right to treat you the way I did. I thought." He struggled to find words that could somehow excuse months of bad behavior, but everything he considered saying sounded inadequate and self-serving. Mitchell studied the younger man for a moment, recognizing genuine remorse when he saw it. In his experience, most people were capable of growth when confronted with their own mistakes, and Davies appeared to be having a genuine moment of self-reflection rather than simply trying to avoid consequences. The older guard had seen enough real enemies to distinguish between malicious intent and simple ignorance. "No apology necessary," Mitchell said simply. "Everyone makes assumptions based on limited information. The important thing is being willing to adjust those assumptions when new evidence becomes available. That's a skill that serves soldiers well in any capacity, whether they're performing ceremonial duties or other types of missions." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of other guards who had witnessed the morning's extraordinary shooting display. Their earlier casual mockery had been replaced by obvious curiosity and newly awakened respect. Word of Mitchell's performance was already spreading through the base, accompanied by speculation about his background that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Sergeant Wilson, one of the older guards who had remained neutral during Davies' earlier campaign of harassment, stepped forward with visible respect. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, would you be willing to provide some shooting instruction to the unit? We could all benefit from learning from someone with your level of expertise, and it might help improve our overall performance during evaluations." Mitchell considered the request carefully. Teaching would require him to reveal more about his techniques and training than he had intended, potentially drawing additional attention to background he preferred to keep private. But it would also serve a legitimate military purpose, and might help build the unit cohesion that had been lacking since his arrival. "I'd be happy to share what I know about basic marksmanship principles," he agreed after a moment's thought, "though I should point out that most of you are already skilled shooters who just need fine-tuning rather than fundamental changes to your technique. Sometimes the difference between good and excellent shooting is just a matter of consistency and attention to small details." Davies watched this exchange with growing realization that his attempt to establish dominance over Mitchell had backfired completely. Instead of exposing weakness, he had inadvertently revealed the presence of exceptional skill and experience within their unit. The quiet guard he had tried to humiliate was now being asked to serve as an instructor, a role that Davies had always assumed would naturally fall to him as the unit's previous top marksman. But rather than resentment, Davies found himself feeling something unexpected: relief. For months, He had carried the pressure of being the soldier others looked to for expertise and guidance. Mitchell's revelation meant that burden could now be shared with someone far better qualified to handle it. There was something liberating about no longer needing to be the best at everything, about being able to learn from someone whose skills so obviously exceeded his own. As the group dispersed to return to their regular duties, Davies lingered behind. "Mitchell," he called out as the older guard prepared to leave. "Thank you for not making me look like more of an idiot than I already had. You could have embarrassed me completely out there, but you chose not to. I won't forget that." Mitchell paused at the equipment room door, considering his response. "We're all on the same team," he said finally. "The goal isn't to make anyone look foolish. It's to make sure everyone can do their job effectively when it matters. Today was just practice, but the habits we build during practice determine how we perform when the stakes are real." With that, he disappeared into the building, leaving Davies alone with his thoughts and a profound new understanding of the man he had so badly underestimated. The morning had begun with an attempt to expose weakness, and had ended with the revelation of extraordinary strength hidden behind an unremarkable facade. It was a lesson in humility that Davies would carry with him for the rest of his military career, and a reminder that true professionals often proved themselves through actions rather than words.